Hi, this is my book, Gonzo Education. You can also find it under Homeless College Student. Yeah, haha, homeless college student. It's one of the most Googled terms in the last 5 years. When I originally started working on this book in 2010, hardly anybody had Googled that term, homeless college student. And so you can find this book, my book, under two different names. When you Google homeless college student now, my book doesn't come up like 100 different news stories, local news stories, national news stories, everybody using the term homeless college student, okay? That's unfortunate. My book should be the first thing that pops up, homeless college student. It's a memoir. It starts when I drop out of high school and ends when I graduate from one of the top journalism schools in the United States. It's called Gonzo because Gonzo journalism is a type of journalism. Most people just associate it with Hunter S. Thompson, but there are other Gonzo journalists out there, and if you research it a little bit, look it up on Wikipedia, Gonzo journalism, you'll see it meets all the requirements to be considered Gonzo journalism. Okay? It's a memoir, it's a homeless memoir. I've compared it with other homeless memoirs, and mine is way better. That sounds conceited, but I didn't spend 7 years of school and going to one of the best journalism schools while I was homeless for nothing. Okay, I didn't spend 5,000 hours working on this book for nothing. No, your book's no good. It would be selling a lot. No, this book is very good, and I'm gonna read it to you right now if you don't believe me. It's so good. It's written by. You'd think it was written by somebody who graduated from one of the top journalism schools in the United States. Oh yeah, it was. Look at the best writers of all time: George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway. All of them were journalists before they were writers. Hunter S. Thompson. And mine goes the same way. So I'm not playing any more games anymore. Now, when you search homeless college student, this is going to be one of the top books. I'm not messing around anymore. I've compared this book to other homeless memoirs, and mine is way better. I remember one book I read. It was about a woman who lived in an RV at Walmart, and it sold like 500,000 copies. I looked at it; it was horrible. I read like almost 100 books a year sometimes. I know what I'm talking about. Anybody? I've spent enough time working on this where I know how good it is. So let's begin here. This is going to be chapter 1. Let's be homeless. Yeah, let's be homeless. In third grade, the worst thing you could grow up to be was a garbage man. Lots of kids wanted to be doctors and lawyers, but if one third grader wanted to install another third grader, he'd say they were going to grow up to be a garbage man. As an adult, I see my peers were wrong with this assessment. Garbage men get paid good money and receive excellent benefits. In most cities, they have support of a union which guarantees them job security and a living wage. My life would have been easier but less interesting if I would have been a garbage man. The first time I was homeless was when I was 16 in 1996. My fraternal twin brother Michael and I were having problems with our father, but we've been dealing with his shit since we were 4 and pretty much gotten used to it by this time. Our mother wanted custody, but her schizophrenia caused a nervous breakdown shortly after we were born. We were her second set of twins. Our two sisters were born 4 years earlier. The odds of a woman having 2 sets of twins is 1 in 700,000. I don't know what the odds of a woman having 2 sets of twins and schizophrenia is, but I'm guessing it's pretty low. Our father made it clear he wanted nothing to do with Michael or me the second we met him, at age 4. We never called him Dad or ever had a conversation with him. We didn't even know what college he went to, what part of New York he was from, or how many brothers and sisters he had. We lived in his house for 10 years, but he was a stranger. Most of our childhood, he made us sleep in a tiny closet in the garage. He should have been thrown in jail for some of the things he did. All we knew was that he was a university professor who didn't like us. He was the opposite with our sisters and gave them plenty of attention. They were named after girlfriends he had before Mom. He lied about his age to them, said he was younger than he actually was, and told them that he never lost a tooth, even though he wore a full set of dentures. He made one his official cook and, didn't mind having both of them, didn't mind them around. Around the time me and Michael turned 12, he told us he was going to kick us out on our 17th birthday. That day was coming, but like millions of other kids around the world, we'd spent our whole life surviving on this planet with very little help from him. Or very little help from parents. Having one less asshole giving us shit on a daily basis was in our best interests. One day, Michael got in a huge fight with him over a driver's ed course he took without his signature. We said about 20 words to him the entire time we lived there, so not having him sign a piece of paper shouldn't have been a big deal. The reason he was pissed off was because Michael paid for the class on his own with his own money. That weekend, we were supposed to go on a road trip with our door-to-door newspaper sales crew. We've been working the job for over 2 years, longer than anyone else. Our crew boss, this old alcoholic named John, had planned a weekend sales trip to Corpus Christi, Texas, but when our father found out Michael took a driver's ed course without permission, he said we couldn't go. The physical part of their battle happened in the front entryway. I had a good vantage point from the top of the stairs. Our father never went upstairs, so it always felt safe. I watched the whole ordeal but didn't get involved. I remember the first fight starting vertically, with both of them yelling in each other's faces like baseball players. When Michael tried to walk away, our father forcefully grabbed his arm. Michael pushed him away, and our father was shocked. Neither of us had ever stood up to him like that before, so he grabbed my brother by the throat and threw him on the entryway floor. Then he got on top of him, put all his weight on Michael's chest, and whispered nasty things a parent should never say to their child. I remember the foam building up around the brim of my father's mouth and watching it as it slowly dripped down onto the side of Michael's cheek. The only thing Michael could do was close his eyes to try to avoid emotional scars. The incident had a profound effect on me and my brother's psyche, and we were never quite the same. It was the final moments of our brief childhood, and neither of us would ever try to make an emotional connection with our father or any other authority figure again. At the time, I didn't quite understand the implications. I just wanted to go on a road trip with my friends. Our newspaper boss, John, was going to be in front of our house honking for us. In a minute, there would be a van chock full of delinquent teenagers in front of our house. Michael was fighting for both of us. I didn't have the guts at the time, but my brother did. Our father's treatment toward us was the strongest bond we shared. He always spoke to us as if we were one person. He didn't talk to us much, but when he did, he'd refer to us as you boys, and never called us by our actual names. Mom was in and out of Kerrville State Hospital when we were growing up, and we hardly ever saw her. She lived across town, worked 2 jobs, and was on a ton of medication. She said we were the most important thing to her, but the only affection we got from her, or from anyone else for that matter, came in the form of a weekday afternoon or every other weekend, if she wasn't committed in the state hospital. The majority of our childhood we spent alone in a cold garage with no toys, parents, or guidance. We learned about the world, how people spoke, and society's manners from neighborhood kids and cable TV. Their fight probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like forever. They wrestled around the entryway floor until Michael finally slid away and ran for safety in the front yard. Our father wasn't going to continue being violent if the neighbors could see. Most of the families in the vicinity of our house have been reporting him to social services for a wide variety of reasons for years. Our sisters would always prep us up on what to say in order not to get him in trouble. It was the only time any of them were ever nice to us. Don't tell them about the puppy that got hanged last fall, or don't tell them that you boys live in the garage. Seconds after Michael ran outside, our newspaper boss, John, pulled up to the house. Michael wiped his tears and jumped in the van like nothing happened. I went outside but hesitated to get in. I walked to the driver's side window to talk to our boss, John, and asked him what was going on. I told him our father said we couldn't go on the trip. John swung his head around and glared at Michael, already comfortable in the back. John knew our father was an asshole. On more than one occasion, he tried to start a conversation with him when he was picking us up or dropping us off. John just wanted to tell him I was the crew's top salesman and breaking all the sales records. Our father was rude and refused to speak to him or even look in his direction. John always took the high road and never responded back. I stood by the van, not really knowing what to do. The rest of the crew had already been picked up. Jonathan, Benny, and all the other guys were shouting, "Get in, Greg, come on, let's go." I couldn't let him down. I was the sales leader and the most important part of the crew. At that moment, I decided to make an adult decision and not let my friends down. I looked back at the house and saw our father glaring out the window. He was seeing if I got in the van. He wanted me to get in. It'd give him a reason to change the locks, bolt the windows, and make sure neither of us ever stepped foot inside his cold-ass house again. John and I agreed to meet at Dairy Queen later. He'd take the crew to sell a few in-town subscriptions and then come and pick me up. I watched them drive away and felt a pang in my stomach. My life was about to change. For the first time, I felt the stress of being an adult. I didn't go back inside the house. Instead, I walked to the Dairy Queen Mom used to take us to. The only other time we got ice cream was when our father would buy a half-gallon of pecan praline. And I hate pecan praline. I still do. My plan was to call the house when we got to the motel in Corpus Christi. Our father would have already gone to sleep, and I could leave a message on the machine saying I was staying at a friend's house. When I got to Dairy Queen, I ordered a Butterfinger Blizzard and ate it slowly. I wasn't hungry. I kept thinking about what happened. I couldn't get the image of our father beating Michael out of my head. My memory is like 1950s flypaper, catching things I'd rather not want to continue to see. I threw away my Blizzard, left Dairy Queen, and went to the barbershop Mom used to take us to. I looked inside and thought about what it would have been like if Mom had custody. Our father never once paid for a haircut, took us to the doctor, the dentist, or even bought us any toiletries. Without Mom's help, things would have been even worse. I left the barbershop and still had time to kill, so I walked across the street to the elementary school we used to go to. We had fond memories there, and when we got older, we'd still meet our friends on the basketball court a few afternoons a week to shoot hoops. I left the barbershop and still had time to kill, so I walked across the street to I took my time strolling around my little kid's stomping ground and reminisced. I felt 100 years old, but I was 16. It was Friday afternoon and there was no one around. I was isolated and alone. I walked by the swings, the monkey bars, and the soccer field. conjuring up what felt like distant memories from recess and lunchtime. After it got dark, I went back to Dairy Queen and spotted John pulling up with a van full of screaming teenagers. Michael was sitting by himself in the corner. He didn't drink back then and was solemn and quiet with a few noticeable scratches and a blue bruise under his left eye. All the other kids were exactly how you expect a bunch of smashed kids who were about to go on an unsupervised road trip to act. It was like Lord of the Flies, and the only adult there had already tossed back 20 beers. I got in and John asked me to drive. How about we let Michael drive instead? I said. Whatever, I'm drunk, John replied. That's how he really talked, too. Michael got behind the wheel, John passed out in the front passenger seat, and a few other guys fished currency out of his muddled pants pockets while Michael drove us to the Texas coast. The trip wasn't as fun as it normally would have been because of what happened before we left. I never called our father from the motel and was nervous the whole weekend. I didn't sell as much as I usually do and couldn't relax. I had no idea what our father was going to do when we got back. I didn't do anything wrong, but Michael had finally stood up to him, and whatever response he had was going to be big and for us both. I started to feel sick on the Sunday night drive back, and John had to pull over so I could throw up. Michael, on the other hand, didn't seem very concerned and said I was worrying over nothing. What are we going to do if we get kicked out? I asked. We'll just live in the woods or Jonathan's backyard, he said. Jonathan was another kid in the newspaper crew who started about the same time we did. He was pretty much a loser before he met us, a clone of his wannabe gangster sister. Michael and I introduced him to weed, Nirvana, and Marlboro Reds. If it doesn't work out at Jonathan's, then we'll just stay with John, Michael said. Yeah, that'll be fun, I sarcastically told him. We'll live with John, his wife, and their 3 kids. John dropped all the other kids in the crew off first before heading to our house. He drove up the hill, leading there slower than usual. Our father was an early riser and a deep sleeper, so if we got back late enough, there'd be a chance he'd already gone to bed and we could sneak inside and go to school the next morning like nothing happened. Just before we were about to get out of the van, John told us if our father started getting violent, then we should come back outside and go with him to his house. I'll just have to talk to my wife, he said. John said he'd be waiting outside and to let him know how it goes. So we can just stay with you? Michael asked John. Well, I'm not even going to try to get in then. I was a kid, not really sure what was going on, but I knew I had an algebra quiz the next morning and wanted a little sleep. John and Michael said they'd wait in the van to see if I got in okay. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't want to get in any more trouble than I already was. The house looked hollow, like nobody lived there. I tried to open the front door, but it was locked. Our father never gave us keys, so this wasn't unusual. I jumped the fence and tried the back, locked too. The final option was always a second-floor bedroom window. So I shimmied up the side of the house, jumped on the roof, and tiptoed over there. I tried to push the window up, but it wouldn't bulge. I looked closer and saw a long wooden board holding it in place. Our father took every precaution to make sure we couldn't get back inside. I went back to the van and told John I couldn't get in. Neither him nor Michael was as surprised as I was, but I see nothing of me and my father. During the drive to John's, we told him we didn't want to go to high school anymore. John thought this was a good idea and saw high school as something that got in the way with selling newspaper subscriptions. Dude, if all you want to do is score with perky broads, wait till you get to college because all the girls put out, John said. John was the first adult who told me that I could still get into college without finishing high school. A GED is just as good as a high school diploma, he said. You can get a master's, a PhD, whatever. Can I still go to the University of Texas, I asked. I want to go to UT in Austin and major in journalism, I told him. Sure can, dude, and you're getting a head start with the paper business, he said in his high-pitched sales voice. If you go the community college route, you get your basics, make a few grades, meet a few broads, and wham, you're on your way to UT. John gave honest advice. Greg, you're a smart kid, that's obvious, he said. It's not about having smarts on the inside. It's about taking advantage of what you have and applying it to your life. Do something with your brain, dude. I could tell John believed in me, one of the few adults who did. Staying at John's house was awkward, and it was obvious his wife wasn't happy. They already had 3 kids and didn't want to add 2 delinquent teenagers. However, their kids enjoyed our company. His 2 young boys liked to practice their wrestling moves on Michael, and their little girl pretended I was a singer in her favorite boy band. Our first night there, I got in trouble when John caught me flushing pot seeds down their new low-flow toilet. I'd never seen him so pissed and got uncomfortable while he scolded me in their family bathroom like I was one of his own kids. I couldn't look him in the eye and stared at his tacky Snoopy bath towels neatly placed by the sink. He couldn't believe I brought marijuana into his drug-free suburban house. John was treating me like a child, and kids hate that. For the first time, I didn't know how to react to him. He didn't seem like such a close friend anymore. If we were at work, riding in the van, and he tried to throw this authority bullshit at me, I would have told him off and might have even gotten into an argument or a fist fight. But now, he was acting like someone I couldn't talk back to or be myself around. After that night, I knew we couldn't ever live comfortably at John's house. It would have changed everything. John had 2 worlds, the clean and tidy world in his suburban subdivision with his family, and the down and dingy underground one he shared with the newspaper crew. The next day, Michael and I went to Jonathan's house and told him we were homeless. Jonathan enjoyed our company. We were basically his only friends, so he let us live in the shed in his backyard. He said all we had to do was stay out of sight from his mom, but even if his mom had caught us, she wouldn't have really cared. It would have been something interesting to tell our coworkers at the water cooler. We were originally going to live in the backyard of another friend from our newspaper crew, Benny. Benny was cooler than Jonathan. He lived in the same neighborhood and had a shed in his backyard too. Benny invited me and Michael to sleep in his shed, but he was mainly doing it just to make a nice gesture. Benny's parents were always home. His biological father was around 80 years old and wandered around the house all night. His mom only worked a few nights a week at a seafood restaurant, so she was always there too. Benny's dad didn't mind me and Michael hanging around, but his mom was notorious for hating the neighborhood kids, especially me and Michael. Benny and his brothers had a lot of friends, and Jonathan didn't have any besides me, Michael, and Benny. Benny's backyard would not have worked because they were always having people over to their pool. Jonathan was 15 when he stopped going to high school and started working for the paper. He was a latchkey kind of kid whose single mom would let him get away with murder. Despite growing up in a poor household, he had feelings of entitlement and expected life to be easy. He acted like he was better and smarter than everyone else. Also a product of his mom's babying. Jonathan's mom was losing her importance to her son. She was determined to be her friend first and her parent second. They were close, and John would come to her with problems, but that was because there was very little risk of discipline. She was the type of mom who'd buy her kids beer on a Friday night. She knew we smoked pot, but she didn't say much about it and actually gave Jonathan money to buy it. She tried as hard as she could to be the cool mom, well-informed, but not judgmental. Michael and I were finally on our own, teenagers full of optimism about our future and the wonderful things it held. For a couple weeks, we slept in the shed in Jonathan's backyard, but after our mom heard, she convinced her husband, Guy, to let one of us stay in an empty room in their house. Michael was having a harder time with shed life than I was, so he went to live with them while I toughed it out. Mom married Guy when Michael and I were in third grade. None of her 4 kids liked him very much, and we all questioned her for settling. Michael was the only one that had a conversation with Guy. He was an accountant who had a bunch of side hustles like selling Amway, betting on sports, dealing Melaleuca, or working at a flea market on Saturdays. I don't want to be alone, Mom would say. Guy was a huge man, about 6'4" and over 300 pounds. He was mostly fat. He had a Texas accent and spoke with a lisp, but he hardly ever said more than 2 words. Guy took the city bus every weekend to his lame accountant job. The kids in the neighborhood would throw rocks at him and call him Fat Frankenstein. Benny had an ongoing joke where he constantly tried to be friendly and make conversation with Guy. Guy always ignored him and just quietly growled. A few times, Benny would wait until he knew Michael and I weren't home before knocking on the door for Guy. Mom would answer the door and say, "Michael and Gregory aren't home, Benny." Benny would smile, wink, and then turn on his Texas accent just like Guy's. "I'm not here to see them. I want to talk to the guy. There he is." Then he'd see Guy mulling around in the background in his underwear, and Benny would try to jokingly force his way inside. "Guy, I see ya. I want to talk Amway, Guy. I want to talk Amway." Benny was like 16 with like purple hair and didn't have a Texas accent. Guy may not have said much, but he made plenty of noise with his burping, moaning, flatulence, and heavy breathing. He was like a sad, retiring, ailing circus bear that was never much fun to begin with. My first stint of homelessness wasn't that bad. I went to work every day and spent most of my time with good friends like Benny, and I always had money in my pocket. For the first time, I didn't have teachers or parents tell me what to do. With no rent or bills to pay, I figured everything I'd heard about life being difficult was poppycock. It wasn't hard to sneak around Jonathan's house and avoid his mom. Michael and I had years of practice sneaking around our father's house. For as long as I can remember, we never got fed enough. Michael even resorted to eating cat food and dog food. He still eats it today. But we usually just took turns sneaking into the kitchen every night to grab food. I was at Jonathan's house every day regardless, so if I ever ran into his mom, it wasn't that big of a deal. We were used to our friends' parents not liking us. It's always been that way. Nobody wanted their kids to hang out with the dirty Brandt brothers who had to steal to eat. It took Jonathan's mom about a month to figure out I was camping in her backyard. Her schedule made her easy to avoid. She was out of the house early every morning and wouldn't get back until late afternoon. By that time, we would have already been picked up by John and off selling newspaper subscriptions in some far-off location. At the end of the night, John would drop me and Jonathan off last. There was a gang of other kids to get home, so most nights we wouldn't get back until midnight. Jonathan's mom would be asleep, and even if she wasn't, we'd just go to the woods, the arcade, or down the street to Benny's backyard. Benny's dad didn't mind if we smoked pot. "Heck, I remember when I was a kid, we used to smoke the bark off of the trees," he said. A month later, Jonathan suggested he ask his mom if I could move in their garage. He said his mom liked me and could convince her to stay, and could convince her to say yes. She charged me rent, but it would be cheap. Before I moved in, his mom sat me down and told me what she expected. I agreed, and the next day we cleaned out their garage and set it up with a bed, air conditioning, and cable TV. The best thing about the place was a private entrance where anybody could come and go at all hours. I had the coolest hangout on the hood, and the deal even came with a new family, a fridge full of munchies, and 3 spirited dogs. The one stipulation with me living there was that I had to get a real job and quit working for the newspaper. Benny was working at the original Fuddruckers Hamburgers down the street from Jonathan's house, so I decided to work there. It was kind of depressing. I made more money, and it was a lot more fun selling papers than it was flipping burgers. I'd pull in at least $400 a week working for John, but I was lucky to make a couple hundred every 2 weeks at Fuddruckers. Lucky for me, Jonathan's mom only charged me $80 a month to live in her garage. Shortly after I moved in, I was arrested for the first time in my life. It was just after I turned 17, so I was convicted as an adult for breaking into a vehicle. Luckily, Texas had recently downgraded my crime from a felony to a misdemeanor, and I didn't have to stay in jail long. However, they gave me a horrible probation stint with a strict, tight-nosed probation officer. He made sure I was under constant supervision and gave me as hard of a time as he could. When I wasn't visiting my PO, I'd be performing the unreasonable amount of community service I was given, where I did back-breaking labor at a park digging ditches for 8 hours straight without pay in the hot Texas sun. I still hung around the same crowd, and everyone still smoked pot. My friends weren't quitting on my behalf. They didn't care if I was on probation, and they did everything they could to get me to continue smoking. One time, I woke up in the middle of the night with Benny blowing a huge bong hit in my face the night before a drug test. My 6 months of probation seemed like a death sentence. When you're a teenager, 6 months is an eternity. I don't know how I was going to survive without smoking pot. Hanging out with my friends and smoking pot was my identity at the time. Identity is the most important thing to a teenager. I wanted to continue my lifestyle, but I needed a substitute for weed, so I started using alcohol. There were lots of stores who'd sell alcohol to minors back then. Every morning I woke up, walked to the corner, and bought a 40-ounce which I drank with the hobos in an abandoned parking lot across the street. Certain people shouldn't be on probation. In December of that year, I found out that my probation had been revoked and I was going to begin serving a 2-month adult jail sentence at the Bexar County Jail and their zero-tolerance boot camp facility. You can see video of the Bexar County Jail on YouTube. It's one of the worst jails in America. Adversity comes in bunches, and right around the time I found out I was going to jail, Jonathan's mom found the pot garden her son and I had been cultivating in the backyard. The plants were my idea. I was on probation and couldn't smoke, so I figured the least I could do was grow some weed for my friends. Jonathan's mom would have been okay with the plants, but she was also stressing out because of her son's new girlfriend. Jonathan had recently started dating an attractive woman much older than he was. He'd just turned 16, but his new, very serious girlfriend was 37. He met her at our local neighborhood crack house. It wasn't what you expect when you heard the term crack house. It was a decent house in a middle-class neighborhood that looked completely ordinary if you were ever to drive by. The caretaker was a middle-aged junkie named Tona. Tona lived down the street from Benny. One day, one of her friend's kids was playing basketball in her driveway, and Benny was riding by doing tricks on his rollerblades. Benny asked to join the basketball game, and when Tona came out to introduce herself, Benny pulled her aside and whispered, "Do you smoke marijuana?" She laughed. Everybody loved Tona. She was in her 30s but acted like a teenager. Tona had an endless amount of beer and weed for us kids. There were plenty of hard drugs used there, but she did a good job keeping all the heavy stuff in the back room away from anyone too young to handle it. All day, different races and ages would come and go from Tona's house. Some were there to buy drugs, some were there to see Tona, and some just wandered up from the alley and the street. The television was always on, and Tona only watched MTV. This was back when the station played music, so it served as an excellent backdrop for all the drug use and interesting characters that frequented her living room. Tona had a huge crack addiction, and I saw firsthand how drugs can destroy someone's vision of reality. She smoked rock, but when she wanted to change a pace or to get really high, she'd inject it into her foot. Sometimes I'd help her find a tourniquet in an open vein. Her husband, Harry, always kept her supplied. We were lucky to have a friend like Tona, and we'd spend most every night either at her house or Benny's backyard drinking her beer and smoking her weed. Tona hooked us up. She was one of the most generous people I've ever known, but cocaine does that to you. She taught us very useful things about how to control your boozing and drink all day. She also taught us how to roll joints with $1, open imported beers with a lighter, and use the stove to light a cigarette. All of this would come in handy later in life. Tona gave us insight into the adult world she knew we'd encounter. In return, we gave her attention. Tona was an agoraphoric drug addict who liked people around her constantly. The only time she left her house was when she had her crackhead husband drop her off across town at her crackhead boyfriend's ghetto apartment for a few nights. Her day revolved more on who would come over and what would happen in her living room rather than where she went or what she got accomplished. Tona's husband, Harry, was old, in his 70s or 80s. He was a crackhead too, but he wouldn't start using until he got off of work. He reminded people of John Wayne. Their relationship revolved around their drug use. Harry met Tona when she was working at McDonald's, her first and only job. I never saw them nice or romantic with each other. It was all about the drugs. Tona was 40 years younger than Harry and played the part of his daughter in their sick relationship. Harry's real daughter refused to speak to him, understandably. Harry was the sole breadwinner with a small rose business he owned and operated out of their house. The roses he sold paid for their mortgage and crack. Every morning he'd wake up early, drive to a rose farm, and buy a bunch of flowers wholesale. At night he'd take attractive women around in his old Cadillac to the sad dive bars and strip clubs. His rose girls would then approach the bar's inebriated patrons and ask them if they'd like to buy a flower. Harry's rose business supported their lifestyle and enabled them to live in a decent house. There were sexy women in their living room every night. Nothing's better when you're 16 than smoking pot and drinking beer with curvy dames in short skirts and elaborate blouses. Most of the girls working for Harry were only interested in money, so the last thing on their mind was a teenager, but one girl stood out. Janet from another planet was a dark-haired beauty with hair like electric space. She'd been working for Harry off and on for a few years. Most of Harry's girls would spend the majority of the night in the back room doing hard drugs, but Janet stayed in the living room and smoked pot with us kids. She hardly even drank. When the other girls would be behind closed doors doing dirty things for money, Janet would be in the living room watching MTV and hitting our homemade bomb. Janet fit in with our group. We didn't think of her as 37. She was older than Jonathan's mom, but hanging out with Janet was nothing like hanging out with Jonathan's mom. We were a breath of fresh air for her, too. She'd gotten tired of all the aggressive jerks she'd been meeting at bars and strip clubs while slanging roses for Harry. Janet was planning on hooking us with one of us from the start. She initially wanted me, obviously, but I knew anything wouldn't have ever worked out with the two of us. Jonathan, on the other hand, was ready and willing for a relationship and wasn't bothered by their age difference. Janet was an incredible person inside and out. No one blamed Jonathan for hooking up with her. He was definitely dating out of his league. John's mom was the only person who had a problem with it, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with Janet or who she was as a person. The problem was that Janet was older than she was, and she felt like she was being replaced. Janet would smoke weed with us in the woods or in Benny's shed every night, but John's mom would never do anything like that. His mom might buy us beer, but it was always forced and awkward. The biggest difference was that Janet spoke to us like equals, and that's the best way to earn someone's respect at any age. There's a big difference between someone who drinks and someone who smokes weed. With weed, you can drive a car, study for a test, or operate heavy machinery. With alcohol, you can't even walk in a straight line or make complete sentences. No one has ever died from pot, but on average, 6 people die in the U.S. daily just from alcohol poisoning. That's not counting all the DWIs and everything like that. Jonathan's mom drank and Janet smoked weed. Janet was a well-grounded person enjoying her life, and Jonathan's mom was swimming in cheap wine trying to control her dopey son. His mom used the pot garden as an excuse to not only kick me out, but also show her son just how much she disapproved of his relationship with the older woman who she refused to meet. Youth doesn't fathom how bad things can get, and the future always seems like it's going to be great. Jonathan and I figured this whole homeless thing was going to be a grand experience. When I look back, I see that he had no reason to worry. Even though we both joked about the fact that we were now bums, Jonathan was never really homeless at all. He was just humoring me. The only thing on his mind was his new girlfriend, and now he had an excuse to move in with her. We left his mom's house and walked to the woods we'd spent many times hanging out in before. It took an hour for his weakness to show, saying he wanted to call Janet and just to tell her what happened. I'll be back in a minute, he said. I'm just going to run to the payphone across the street. I waited in the cold, and the optimism I had faded. A bolt of nervousness hit me when I realized he was going to leave me in the woods and stay with his girlfriend. Being young and homeless is not something you want to do alone. At that moment, I realized the world is a much colder place than I ever thought it was. I finally got a grip of reality and how much it relates to my happiness and well-being. When Jonathan finally got back, he had an incredibly dumb look on his face. He strolled up to where I was sitting at in the woods and wouldn't make eye contact. Instead, he made silly comments about the weather while blowing into his hands for warmth. I asked him what took so long, but he wouldn't answer. There was a brief moment of silence before I stood up, looked him in the eye, and asked if he was ditching me. Listen, I know you're not going to want to hear this, he said, but it's obvious that you're jealous of Janet and me and want what we have. John Boy was more confident than I had ever seen him before. Here's the deal. You're either with me or against me. And if you're against me, then you can go screw yourself. I didn't know how to respond to my best friend. I honestly didn't care about him or his 37-year-old girlfriend. I had the more immediate concern about freezing to death in the woods. I kept my cool, took a breath, and asked, well, if I'm with you instead of against you, does that mean I can go to Janet's house too? Jonathan threw up his hands and yelled, no, this is exactly what I mean. You just want what we have. You're jealous. I was upset but didn't show it. It wouldn't have been practical. I told Jonathan I'd wait for him until his girlfriend showed up, keeping hope he'd change his mind and invite me to come to the warm house too. When Janet finally pulled up to the road adjacent to the woods, she didn't bother getting out of the truck. Jonathan ran out to the street and shouted, "Laters," without turning around. When they drove away and were out of sight, I let out my pain. I screamed and shouted and kicked some innocent trees. When I finished my tantrum, I sat on a rock and noticed how sweaty I'd gotten from this exertion. I took my jacket off and concentrated on each cloud of smoke my breath made. 20 minutes later, the sweat on my body turned cold and I began to shiver. My legs started to get numb and I was showing the signs of hypothermia. I thought about knocking on Benny's window, but then I remembered he was on vacation in South Padre. So I limped to the only apartments nearby and stumbled around its buildings until I found a closet, a patio, or a hole to crawl inside. I finally found the apartment's laundromat, but the door was locked. So I climbed up a ledge and jimmied open one of the windows before using the last bit of strength I had left to pull my freezing body up by my forearms and slide inside. I landed, plop, on the laundry room floor in a warm room with a comforting laundry smell. There was a slight radio playing in the background that added to my feeling of well-being. I crawled under a table, slid behind a trash can, and fell sound asleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of an early riser doing his laundry. He didn't say anything or tell me to leave, so I rolled back into a ball and continued sleeping. A few hours later, I slithered out to the street. The sun came out from behind the clouds, and I felt relieved to have survived my first freezing night outside. I didn't know where to go from there, so I wandered around the neighborhood I grew up in like a lost dog whose family moved without telling him. I finally ended up by some railroad tracks that weren't near any streets, people, or businesses. It was the best place to hide the shame of being homeless and unloved. For the rest of the day, I wrote poems about being beaten alone by the railroad tracks. At the time, I had a maudlin notion of one day writing a great book. I watched the freight trains go by and I tried to figure things out. The only people you ever saw by these railroad tracks were stereotypical homeless people, the kind with shaggy beards and filthy hands holding cardboard signs standing on street corners. I hung around the tracks alone for a few hours. I didn't write any great poetry, but I did find a piece of aluminum foil that had a half-burnt bowl of pot still in it. I smoked the pot, meditated, and tried to find some sort of purpose or direction in life. Getting high put me in a better mood, and I was actually able to laugh about my situation. Later that afternoon, I noticed two bums slowly walking towards me. I got a little nervous and began to plan out what I was going to say. It felt like high school all over again. When they got closer, I realized I actually knew one of them. It was a bum I'd smoked weed with named Kenny. Kenny was one of the only transients who hung around Jonathan's neighborhood. He chilled with a few of the local non-homeless people because he didn't look that homeless, just poor. Kenny was a little over 30 and had a deep East Texan accent that matched his southern mullet, which he always kept combed. He wore decent second-hand clothes, free from cigarette burns and masturbation stains, and always carried a comb and toothbrush wherever he went. It's easy to give up on that kind of thing when you're living on the streets, so you gotta respect someone who keeps himself upright despite sleeping rough. The first night I met Kenny was a week after I moved into Jonathan's garage. It was cold outside and he didn't have anywhere to sleep, so I let him crash on the floor. I figured I was doing the right thing. Before that night, whenever I went to sleep, I'd take my wallet, keys, and whatever else was in my pocket and put it all in one of my shoes. But that night I let Kenny stay with me in the garage. I woke up the next morning with exactly half the money in my wallet gone. Since then, I always sleep with my wallet safely snug on my ass. I put Kenny's previous deception in the past because I wanted someone to talk to. I've been babbling to myself by the railroad tracks all day. This is normal for me, but many men have gone crazy doing the same thing. Kenny was happy to see me, but the guy he was with looked at me like the way people looked at tax collectors during biblical times. I can read it without looking at it because I'm so familiar with it. I spent the rest of the afternoon with my two new homeless pals. Kenny was cool and talkative, but his friend stayed silent with a mean look on his face. Kenny's friend was an ugly old man with warts and missing patches of skin. He kept staring at me and licking his lips, which made him even more creepier than he already was. I made every attempt to convince him I was okay, but nothing seemed to work. When it got dark, Kenny invited me back to their camp. I had no logical choice but to accept. They knew I had no money, so I wasn't that worried about getting robbed. Their site was about a mile away, hidden in between a patch of bushes and an abandoned warehouse. There was beer cans, cigarette butts, and human excrement scattered all over the place. They'd obviously been there for some time. Kenny lit a small fire while I found a piece of cardboard to lie down on. I used my backpack as a pillow and tried to get comfortable. It wasn't as cold as the night before, and I felt pretty good. I thought of myself as a homeless cowboy under the Texas stars. Humans have been sleeping like this forever, I told myself. Kenny and his friend drank bush beer while I pretended to sleep. I was tired of their conversation. It was fun for the first hour, but I didn't want to have to keep on thinking of things to say to these stupid bastards. Whenever the conversation got quiet, it felt like something bad was about to happen to me. When I finally convinced them that I was asleep, I realized what was going on. Kenny had some crack that he was planning to share with his wart-covered friend. This is why his friend had been giving me the stink eye all night. He was waiting for Kenny to break out the candy, but Kenny didn't want to pull it out with me around. The fire had sizzled down, and it got colder. I heard the sound of crinkling cellophane, but I continued to pretend to be asleep. I may have been homeless, but I knew smoking crack wouldn't have been a good idea, at least not at this particular point in my life. After the drugs kicked in, they started being incredibly loud, so I sat up and lit a cigarette. Nobody could pretend to sleep with the commotion that they were making. Kenny's dirty friend saw me smoking a cigarette and started screaming, "He's awake! He's awake!" "Yes, I'm awake," I responded. Kenny ran over and started stuttering. "Oh, we're just..." He couldn't think of anything to say. "I don't care," I yelled. "I just want to get some sleep." Then I actually did fall asleep, but I woke up at sunrise with Kenny's friend lightly kicking my side. He was screaming at me to hand over the rock. Kenny tried to calm his friend down, but the guy was cracked out of his mind. He thought I'd gotten into his bag and pocketed some crack to smoke by myself. The man was having delusions that I wanted no part of. It was a far cry away from my Kerouac ideas of writing poetry by the railroad tracks. I had enough, grabbed my stuff, and bolted like a track star. I knew both of them were too old and out of shape to follow, so I ran away as the faint yells of Kenny bellowing me to come back faded in the distance. When I got far enough, I slowed to a jog. Other than having to carry my huge backpack, it was a peaceful run. It reminded me of track meets in grade school. After the first mile, I saw familiar territory and I realized I was only a few blocks from Tona's house. I was hungry, tired, and relieved to see somewhere I've been told I was always welcome. I figured I'd tell Tona about the bums of the railroad tracks and she'd have a good laugh. Tona always loved my stories, but when I got to the edge of her street, I felt a weird vibe coming over me. Something wasn't right. Like I shouldn't be there. I'd been there 100 times before, but this time something felt odd, like I had done something wrong. I rang the doorbell, but nobody answered. I heard the TV on, so I knew someone was home. I knocked loudly until someone finally came to the door. I expected to see Tona, but instead Jonathan appeared with a mean look on his face. He opened the main door, but kept the screen door shut and spoke to me through the wire frame. I was surprised by his coarse behavior and asked him what was going on. He stiffened his brow, looked me square in the eye, and firmly said I couldn't come inside. I was stunned. "Where's Tona?" I asked. "She's not home," he said. I knew this was a lie because Tona never left the house. "Look, Jan and I are watching the place for her until we get our place of our own," he said. "I know what you're trying to do, but it's not working." I felt betrayed by the few people I thought were my friends. I was hungry and alone, and it would have been nice to go inside, somewhere. However, I'd been turned into the villain while I was playing bum at the railroad tracks the night before. I found out later that Janet and Jonathan had moved into Tona's extra bedroom and told her I was trying to ruin their relationship and tear them apart. I left Tona's house and walked to the end of her street and then to the end of her neighborhood. I felt weak, lightheaded, and I hadn't eaten in a while. I wanted to avoid going to Mom and Guy's house before I went to jail, but I needed food. Mom lived about 5 miles from Tona's driveway, and on an empty stomach, I knew it was going to be a long walk, but I figured it'd be worth it to get some food in my belly. I needed to go somewhere where someone gave a shit about me. My twin brother Michael was the closest thing to that I had. During my walk, I figured I'd ask Mom if I could stay a few nights before I went to jail. I wasn't asking for much, and I knew I'd be gone soon. I was actually looking forward to jail. 3 hots and a cot sounded better than anything I had going for me at the time. I called my probation officer to see if I could move my surrender date to a couple of weeks earlier than originally planned. I'd do my time, move on with my life, and get out of homelessness. The life of a vagabond wasn't as romantic as I thought, and the only thing I could think about was finding somewhere to live and something to eat. I took my time walking to Mom's, taking plenty of breaks and stopping at a couple different parks for water. When I got to her house, I sat in their driveway for a couple hours before knocking on Michael's window. He was up late working on his artwork, and Mom had already gone to sleep. Michael said he felt lucky they were letting him stay there, and he didn't envy my position. The last thing he wanted was for me to mess things up for him, so I couldn't come inside, but he said I could hang out in the backyard with their smelly-ass dog, Elmo. He said he'd bring me some food and covers. It was the best offer I had. An hour later, he came out with a blanket, a radio, and some stale hot dog buns. Early the next morning, when Mom and Guy left for work, I broke inside for more food. I made a peanut butter sandwich and laid my sad bones on their couch, falling asleep to the sounds of The Price is Right. I slept on the grungy couch for a few hours before getting up and calling Mom at work. I told her I was going to call my probation officer and start serving my sentence early. I asked Mom if I could stay till then. She was sympathetic as usual and heartbroken to see her oldest son going to jail. She told me she tried to convince Guy to let me stay a few nights. Guy let me stay for a week, but he said I had to be gone from morning to midnight and make sure to confirm my new surrender date and get my ass to county jail ASAP. I called my probation officer the next day and explained my situation before asking if I could go to jail early. I want to get it over with, I told him. The officer was surprised and told me something like, well, I guess you could turn yourself in early, but you weren't scheduled till the end of the month, so I don't know why you would. Even though I had elucidated the tool about my hard-knock circumstances, he wasn't sympathetic. He should have told me that turning myself in early wasn't going to help anything. I was due to be transferred from jail to the zero-tolerance boot camp facility on a particular day. If I turned myself in early, I'd be volunteering to go to jail for no reason. The officer said he needed a moment to think it over. He called me back an hour later and said, yeah, sure, you can turn yourself in early, but I can't guarantee that you'll get out of jail and over to boot camp any earlier than they expect you. During this time in Texas, probation officers felt that their job was to get as many people in jail as possible. Every life knocked out of whack was a victory. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and the majority are there for nonviolent drug offenses. Possession of marijuana is the most common offense. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice, in 2008, there were over 7 million U.S. citizens in jail, prison, or on probation. That's about 1 in 30. Since 1980, the prison population has quadrupled. A large reason for this is because of mandated sentences which came about the war on drugs, but the increase comes during a period when crime has dropped by 25%. I had a few days of rest at Mom's house before turning myself in. It was nice to eat, sleep, and talk to her before I got locked up. She was worried, so I reassured her that I was going to be in the safe part of the jail. There'd be guards watching us and no one was going to try to beat or rape me. I showed her how many push-ups and sit-ups I could do. Do what they tell you to do and they'll let you come home, she said. Yeah, home, I said sarcastically. I took the bus to the downtown jail, but the guards thought I made a mistake and didn't want to let me in. So I explained my situation. They looked at me like I was crazy. I started to get upset that I wasn't welcome in jail and told them to call my probation officer. After 2 long hours, they finally put the cuffs on and showed me to my room. For the next few months, I was locked in cages with hardcore felons. I'd never be the same person I was going in. Most kids my age were finishing high school, going to prom, and planning their graduation party. I was learning about violence, crime, and sociopaths. Most of the inmates I was forced to interact with would spend their lives in and out of the system, never contributing much to society. I may have been young, but I knew these weren't the type of people I wanted to be around. It was hard to grasp exactly how I got there, but this was my life, and it was up to me to do everything I could to improve it. That was chapter 1 of my, I got chills right there. That was chapter 1 of my great book, Homeless College Student. It starts when I drop out of high school, as you can hear in chapter 1, and it ends when I graduate from one of the top journalism schools in the United States. It's written at a really easy, fast-paced, easy read. If you're not normally reading books, if you want something easy to read, Homeless College Student is be a really easy book to read if you're doing a book report. Also, another great book to do a book report on. And I'm really proud of it. You know, like I said, I dropped out of high school but still graduated from one of the country's top universities. The only school I ever wanted to go to, the University of Texas. I only ever wanted to get a degree in journalism. This book, it goes over 5 different newspaper routes I had with 5 different people. It goes over my time selling newspaper subscriptions door to door. It goes over my time selling newspaper subscriptions over the phone. It goes over the brief period I sold newspaper subscriptions in California. And I'm really proud of this book. So if you listen to this, thanks. And I'll put a link. You can find it for free on Amazon right now. It's Homeless College Student. Thanks for watching.